You'll have to excuse me. I had to change the recharge the battery. I'm sorry. We're about an hour and maybe an hour or so later than the last part. Okay. The history of domestic violence. I want to talk about this a little bit. Domestic violence has been around, holy shit, probably since human beings have been around. But remember I said a few times the courts always write the law, not the Congress or the Parliament, whatever the hell else we have. In the 1600s, this is a little sensitive, but I'm going to talk about it. In the 1600s, there was a judge named Sir Matthew Hale in England. And Judge Hale heard a complaint of a woman who accused her husband of rape. And Judge Hale reasoned that a woman could wrongfully accuse her husband of rape, which is true. But because he has unlimited consent, she vowed to love, honor, and obey him, he has unlimited consent. And therefore it is his right and privilege to beat her, rape her. And so a woman is the property of her husband, and nothing he does to her is a crime. Now, that is some disturbing, sexist shit. And if a judge said that today, he would be disbarred in 30 seconds. But don't forget, this is 400 years ago almost. Very sexist, prejudiced time. And that was the law. And it was the law. It was carried over to the New World. And a man could do anything he wanted. A man literally had to murder his wife in order to be even arrested. And men beat their wives, they beat their children, and domestic violence existed behind the scenes. No one wanted to talk about it, no one gave a shit, so what? Sweep it under the rug. And there was a time in American history when a woman would call the police and say, my husband raped me, and the police would hang up on her. And there was a time in American history when a woman would walk into the police station with her head gushing full of blood, and the police would throw her out of the police station. Now, when the police finally did respond, eventually, this is years later, the police had two approaches. One approach was have two cops go in. One cop will bandage the victim up. The victim is 90% of the time a woman. The suspect is 90% of the time a man. One police officer would bandage the woman up. The other police officer would take the husband to the bar and give him a couple of shots of whiskey. They'd go home. They would go home. The police would leave. What do? They beat each other up again. And then other times, the police would have another tactic. They would have 10 cops come over the house and drag the husband in the back room. Yeah. It was brutal. It really was brutal. And then around the year I was born, 1982, a lot of police departments decided that they needed to do something. Yeah, finally you need to do something. Wow. So the police started what they call mandatory arrest. This was prompted by several reasons. Number one, women's lib. Women now said we're citizens and we want rights. Okay. In addition to that, remember, the police are responsible for safety. And when the police fail to protect the citizenry, they are at fault. And you had women suing the shit out of the police department because their husbands beat them up and the police didn't even care. So that happened. Then, in addition to that, you had some high-profile cases. In addition to that, remember I said not murdering your husband? There were women that murdered their husbands in cold blood. And when the police came and arrested them, you know what their defense was? I called you 17, 18 times and you didn't respond to me. What do you expect me to do? So the police decided to do what they call mandatory arrest. And that means once they get to the scene, they see domestic violence, arrest. They don't care who wants to press charge, they arrest. And if it's in question who started the fight, they'll arrest everybody. I've known cases of it. And then there was another aspect of this issue. First and foremost, the victim has either low self-esteem and feels it was their fault, or they have a third party say he's your husband, he's your girlfriend, or she's your girlfriend, or this is your son, or this is your father. Do you really want to press charges? Do you really want to do this, etc., etc.? And they would go and they would drop charges. They would post bail for the suspect, and the suspect would be back in the house with the victim within a couple of hours. So then the prosecutors had their own problem. And they said, from now on, we're going to prosecute. And I've been in the courtrooms and I've seen the prosecutor. Victim drops the charges. Literally 2 seconds later, the prosecutor still not dropped nothing. So now when the prosecutor gets a complaint on his desk, he presses charges regardless of what anybody else says. Also, the suspect could also threaten the victim into dropping the charges, but the prosecutor takes over now. The judges also started to get involved. And judges said, you're going to have a restraining order. And according to media reports, which can be wrong, Chris Brown has a restraining order in favor of Rihanna. He cannot come near her. Rihanna allegedly, media report, didn't want the restraining order. Well, the judge didn't give a shit. And the judges I know, the judges I worked with, they don't give a shit. Domestic violence, restraining order. You don't like it, then tough. And this is kind of hostile. The government, the man, the judge, the prosecutor, the cop is coming into your life and pressing charges and making arrests. But you know what? It's the lesser of two evils. The only option is to allow the victim to press charges. And if the victim wants to press charges, that's fine. If the victim doesn't want to press charges, the violence continues. This is the one case out of 1,000 where the man, the justice system, the big brother needs to be involved and needs to take over. I also forgot to mention earlier, who is the domestic violence offender? Okay, yes, 90% of the time the offender is the man and the victim is the woman. However, I've seen cases where the woman abuses the man. Domestic violence could be adults abusing children, physically and sexually. Domestic violence could be children fighting adults. Domestic violence could be adults abusing their elderly parents and grandparents. Domestic violence could be two roommates fighting. I've seen cases where a guy would run into his ex-girlfriend on the street, threaten her, and the judge would say this is domestic violence. There is no skin color for domestic violence. Black, white, Asian, Mexican, no, Hispanic. There's no skin color, there's no gender, there's no social status, there's no religion. Anybody can be the victim, anybody can be the offender. No matter what color you are, no matter what class you are. You see celebrities involved in domestic violence, you see commoners involved in domestic violence. You see rich people involved in domestic violence, you see poor people involved in domestic violence. You see domestic physical violence, domestic psychological violence, and you see domestic sexual violence. It happens. Okay, I want to go over a list. I'm going to go over this list I printed out, and this is from a report I made. I forgot to mention earlier, I'm going to mention the report in the next video. So I'm going to cut, and I'm going to do this, because this is going to take a while. So we're going to do that.